Hello everybody, this is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The video you are about to see is an Orthodox presentation explaining 5 key eschatological symbols in the book of Revelation. Those symbols are 666, number 1, number 2, the Whore of Babylon, number 3, the 200 billion man army, number 4, the 7 kings, and number 5, Armageddon. I hope you enjoy it. Let's start out with the first eschatological symbol in the book. This is number 11 in my series of 15 that I am explaining in my series on Revelation in my Orthodox Preterist channel. 666. Let me read Revelation 13 verse 18. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast. That's the sea beast, which stands for the Roman Empire. So let this man who has understanding calculate the number of the Roman Empire beast, for it is the number of a man. So the number is the number of an empire and the number of a man at the same time. And the number is 666, or 666. Now, who is the man? I'm going to try to show to you that the man is Nero. This is the so-called Antichrist. Although you'll notice the verse does not mention the word Antichrist. It mentions beast, the sea beast, the Roman Empire. Why Nero? Because he's the man who most malevolently represents the sea beast. He's the most evil Roman emperor of them all. Now look at the orange word, calculate. Notice that that word is not recognize the 666, but calculate. In order to understand who Nero was, John's readers had to actually do some mathematical calculation in order to figure out who the beast was. Now, there's not going to be a future Antichrist with a 666 on his chest or on his wrist or on his forehead or anywhere. That's just mythology. The Antichrist was, the beast was Nero. Now notice that it talks about, the green word there is beast, which is talking about the sea beast, the Roman Empire. And it's a beast. It's not an Antichrist. So you see, the number is the number of the empire, not just a man, but of an empire. And the last word there, the blue word, is understanding. Calculation must be done in order for someone to understand what the 666 stood for. The only way that that's going to be done is you have to take Nero's Hebrew name, as we'll see, and calculate the number of his Hebrew name, and then the reader would understand what John was talking about. Now, why did John used Nero's Hebrew name to do this? Because he was under suspicion. He eventually was, well, as a matter of fact, he was exiled already to the Isle of Patmos. The Roman authorities didn't like him. If he started writing things about Nero, bad things, calling him a beast, comparing him to a beast, and he used Hebrew's Greek name, there's enough Romans to know Greek, they could have figured out real quick what 666 referred to. But using the Hebrew name, this masked what John was about, who he was referring to. Now, there was enough Christians who knew Hebrew that they could figure out what this 666 referred to using the Hebrew. So let's now go to 3 reasons why 666 points us to Nero. Well, first of all, the calculation of the number gives us Nero. Now, each Hebrew letter doubled for a number, just like in Roman numerals. An L stands for 50, an X stands for 10, a V stands for 5. Well, likewise, the Hebrews did the same thing. And if you take Nero's English name, or I should say his English name, his Hebrew name, which as it's translated into English is Neron Caesar, and forgive my Hebrew pronunciation, I don't know how to pronounce Hebrew. You drop the vowels because the Hebrew didn't have the vowels. You take the numbers of the consonants that are left, and guess what? You come up with 666. So the numbers work perfectly. Well, that's the first reason to think that 666 refers to Nero. Let's look at the second reason, the context of the chapter. The 666 number is found in Revelation chapter 13. Well, if you will look back in the previous portions of that chapter, you'll see the discussion of the land beast and the sea beast. The land beast is causing all those who live on the land to worship the sea beast. All the Jews are now sucking up and bowing down idolatrously to the Roman Empire. We talked about that in the last video. So we're talking about the Roman Empire receiving idolatrous worship. Well, who is the perfect epitome of the Roman Empire? None other than Nero, one of the most notorious and infamous emperors of that empire. Third reason that we can confidently assume that the 666 refers to Nero is history, historical logic, if you will. I remember so well, I wanted to read a biography of Nero. So I went to my college library, checked out a biography of Nero, and it turns out it was an historian who was trying to revise the received view of Nero, that he was a monster, a pervert. And in order to carry out his revisionist scheme, he made this argument. He said the reason that Nero had such a bad reputation is because of the Christians. The Christians all were going around saying he was the Antichrist, and that tarnished his reputation. Well, I don't think he succeeded in revising my opinion of Nero. I think most people still think that Nero was a monster, but it was so interesting to me that this historian pointed out that every Christian was saying that Nero was the Antichrist. Was it a radical idea back then? Of course, today it's radical. People like me who say that Nero's the Antichrist, we're looked at as like we're some kind of nuts, like we're on the fringe. Well, it wasn't the fringe back in the first century. All right, so that's the first symbol that we're going to take up in this video. The second is the whore of Babylon, or as John calls her later on in the late in the chapter 17, he calls her the mother of all whores. Great language here, the whore of Babylon. Let me read Revelation 17, verses 1 through 2. The great prostitute who sits on many waters, with her the kings of the earth, or I'm going to translate that, the rulers of the land. I'll explain why in a minute. The rulers of the land committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the land were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. The reason I can translate that is kings. The word for kings is basileus in the Greek. And I found a definition in Thayer which says, well, I'll give it to you in a minute, but it basically means a commander or a ruler of the people, a leader. And so and of course, earth is gay, which can either mean earth or land. So all the leaders of the land, all the Jewish leaders, the synagogue leaders, and all the cities and all the towns, they all sucked up to that Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, which stood for apostate Israel, who is the whore of Babylon. So all the leaders of Israel committing adultery, spiritual adultery with this whore, the apostate Jerusalem, and the inhabitants of the land were intoxicated with the wine of her adultery. So this evil system that ended up killing Jesus and the prophets is said to be a spiritual whore. So the whore of Babylon is Jerusalem, apostate Jerusalem, the same Jerusalem that was destroyed in AD 70. Now, she is called a great prostitute in chapter 17, verse 1. Now, if we go to Ezekiel, chapter 16, verse 29, we'll see that Ezekiel says to the Israelites, you multiplied your whoring also with Chaldea. Chaldea is another name for Babylon, earlier name for Babylon. So Ezekiel says, you're committing spiritual adultery with Babylon. Babylon's a perfect symbol of spiritual adultery because where were all the idols? I mean, they're famous for wizards and wise men and occult, sorcery, you name it. It all came out of Babylon. And so she's a great prostitute. So that's a perfect thing to compare the spiritual adulterers in Jerusalem. Compare her with Babylon because Babylon was so full of idolatry just like Jerusalem was. Now you'll notice that this great prostitute is sitting on many waters. Well, waters, that's an easy reference, takes you to Babylon. You'll notice in this verse here that there's no mention of Babylon actually. We'll find out later that later in the chapter she is called Babylon. But even without the explicit reference, we know that it's Babylon because of this reference right here to waters. Babylon dwelt on many waters. We can look at Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 13, who says this, O you Babylon, who dwell by many waters, rich in resources, your end has come. Why is Babylon said to dwell on many waters? Because historically Babylon was a city that had many intersecting canals that ran through the city from one side to the other, drawing off water from the Euphrates River. And so it was famous for having a lot of canals. So this is very well-known imagery. Now you notice the kings of the land that I've already mentioned there. The rulers of Israel were fornicating with the whore. The leaders of the land, the Jewish leaders, the synagogue leaders, the civic leaders who sat in the gate, all these people gave their allegiance to this idolatrous, evil system with the high priest and with the Pharisees and with all the ugly, nasty, phony spirituality and legalism and murderous intent in their heart. The same nation that murdered Jesus. All the rulers of the land of Israel were fornicating with her spiritually. All right, going on talking more about the whore of Babylon, we read verse 3. John says, I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that had 7 heads and 10 horns. Well, we've talked about the beast before. He wasn't mentioned as being scarlet in chapter 13, but he was mentioned as having 7 heads and 10 horns. If you recall, the 7 heads and 10 horns tie this beast down specifically to Rome, because the 7 heads stand for the famous 7 hills of Rome, and the 10 horns stand for the famous 10 provinces of Rome about that time. Now, what does sitting on mean? If you sit on something, you're supported by the thing you're sitting on. Israel was entirely supported by Rome. Israel entirely depended on Rome. If you read Josephus, you'll be convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt how Rome depended on Israel. Herod the Great was constantly sucking up to Rome. His first great friend was Mark Antony. When Mark Antony got destroyed at Actium in 31 BC, and Mark Antony took over, Herod did some slick political maneuvering and switched his allegiance from Antony to Octavius. He was totally dependent on the Roman Empire. And by the way, there are some preterists who say that the prostitute is not Israel, but is the Roman Empire. But that doesn't make any sense to me, because it's clear that the beast that the prostitute was sitting on, the beast is the Roman Empire. If you say the prostitute's the Roman Empire, then you got the Roman Empire sitting on the Roman Empire, which makes no sense. So I think it's very clear that this whore of Babylon is apostate Jerusalem. Moving on to Revelation 17:4, still talking about the whore of Babylon, it says, the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet. She had a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things. Abominations usually refer to idolatries, and so this is again referring to the idolatry of apostate Jerusalem. And here you'll notice the purple text and the gold text. In the purple text, I point out that the whore is wearing purple and scarlet. Now, these were 2 of the main colors of the high priest's vestments, his garments. If you'll go back and read in the law, in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, and read the description of the high priest's robes, gold and scarlet, which is the same, by the way, as the temple and the curtains, too. The curtains in the temple, gold and scarlet. So this is a typical color. And so what John is trying to do, he's trying to make a parody of the high priest and say this whore is like the high priest in Jerusalem, who of course by this time was not representing Yahweh, but was representing evil. And also the golden cup. Now this golden cup is a parody, a mocking, if you will, of the high priest who held up a cup when he was making his libations in the priestly service. I'm not exactly sure which libation the high priest did. Perhaps he poured out the wine before the bronze altar. I'm fuzzy on that, but the point is he made libations and he poured them out of a golden cup. Let me read you a quote from a well-known scholar on Revelation. This is J. Massingbird Ford. She says this, this golden cup shows that this was a parody of the high priest on the Day of Atonement, wearing the vestments especially reserved for that occasion, in other words, the vestments with purple and scarlet, and holding the libation offering. Libation means drink, the drink offering, the wine offering. So this is recognized Ford, I don't believe, is a preterist, but she's a well-recognized scholar of Revelation, and she says that this phrase right here is referring to the high priest golden cup. So here we have a mockery of the high priest in Jerusalem. He's become a whore, a spiritual whore. All right, moving along, still talking about the whore of Babylon, we'll go to verse 6 in chapter 17. John says this, I saw the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints. Well, how could she be drunk with the blood of the saints? She killed a lot of Christians, basically. The Jews, the apostate Jewish kingdom, killed many of the Old Testament prophets. They killed Jesus. They killed the early apostles. They killed Christian prophets. They killed Christian evangelists. They chased the Christians all over the Roman Empire until they were destroyed in AD 70. Now, this was something that Jesus had already predicted about these apostate Jews. In Matthew chapter 22, verse 34, he said this, Therefore, I send you, talking about he sends to the Jews, the non-believing Jews, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes. Now, he's using Jewish language here because that's what they're going to understand. What he actually sent was Christian prophets, and wise men and scribes were Christian teachers. He was going to send them believers in Jesus. Therefore, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town. Persecute from town to town. Does that not sound like the book of Acts? So the whore of Babylon drank the blood of the Christian saints. Apostate Judaism did that. All right, moving along in chapter 17, verse 16, still talking about the whore of Babylon, we read this, the beast of the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Now, this is when Jerusalem goes down. Before, Jerusalem and the Roman Empire, the prostitute and the sea beast, upon which she was riding, got along fine. The sea beast supported the prostitute and everything was cool. But then, all of a sudden, the beast turned around and attacked the prostitute, brought her to ruin, left her naked, and ate her flesh and burned her with fire. Destroyed her. Well, that's what happened in the Jewish war. It describes the Jewish war perfectly. Now, right until just before the Jewish war, as I said, they were getting along, and then a Roman official named Gessius Florus abused the Jews, and he really did. It's hard to blame the Jews for revolting, really. They were treated so badly. Well, they reacted. You have the Jewish war from 66 through 70, and what was the result of that Jewish war? Jerusalem was burnt with fire. Now notice in this chapter, this verse here in Revelation, John says that the beast will burn her, the prostitute, with fire. If the beast stands for the Romans and the whore of Babylon stands for the apostate Jewish kingdom, that means the Romans will burn the Jews with fire. Well, that's exactly what happened. In AD 70, the city was burnt up, just like John predicted in Revelation 17. Now, Jesus had also predicted this earlier in a parable. This is in Matthew 22, verses 2 through 7. This is the parable of the wedding banquet. I'm going to read this to you right now. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for the son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited, but they refused to come. Then he sent some more servants, but they paid no attention. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. This, of course, is referring to God, who sent his prophets to Israel, and Israel was not interested in going to any wedding feast that God had anything to do with, and so they killed all the prophets. Continuing with Matthew 22, the king was enraged. He sent his army and burned their city. Well, what army did he send? He sent the Romans and burned their city, Jerusalem. So even this parable directly refers to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. All right, moving along still with the whore of Babylon in verse 18, John says this, the woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth, and I'm going to translate that over the rulers of the land. As I've said earlier, that's a perfectly legitimate translation. Basileus, king, can mean ruler or leader, and earth is gay, can mean land. Let's focus on the term great city here. I'm going to show you that this great city is Babylon, and the great city is Jerusalem. First of all, we'll look at Revelation 11:8. This is talking about the two witnesses. It says their bodies will lie in the street of the great city. which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. Well, now, where was their Lord crucified? Where was the Lord crucified? He was crucified in Jerusalem. And so the two witnesses were laid out in the great city, which is Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is the great city. Now we'll go to Revelation 16. The great city, this is Revelation 16, verse 19. The great city split into three parts. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. Now there, the great city is explicitly identified with Babylon the Great. So in chapter 16, the great city is Babylon the Great. In chapter 11, the great city is where the Lord was crucified is Jerusalem. So the great city is Jerusalem, the great city is Babylon. Two things equal to the same thing. Jerusalem and Babylon are equal to the same thing, the great city. Therefore, Jerusalem is equal to Babylon. Babylon is equal to Jerusalem. Babylon, the whore of Babylon, is Jerusalem. That's one more proof that that whore sitting on that sea beast, that scarlet sea beast, that whore was Jerusalem. In fact, you can just go to Revelation 17 and substitute in here. The woman you saw is the great city. Well, what's the great city? In chapter 16, the great city was Babylon the Great. See the orange there? See the yellow? The great city is Babylon the Great. So let's take out the great city, the orange, and put in the yellow. The woman, going back to chapter 17, verse 18, the woman you saw is Babylon the Great that rules over the rulers of the land. So the whore of Babylon is Jerusalem. Let me repeat this argument. If you have trouble seeing this, stop the tape, stop the video, and go back and look at this. The logic is very clear, but sometimes you have to think about it a little bit. The logic works like this. If the great city is Jerusalem, Revelation 11, and the great city is Babylon, Revelation 16, then Babylon is Jerusalem, because two things equal to the same thing are equal to each other. The whore is the great city in verse 18. So the whore of Babylon is apostate Jerusalem. All right, let's move on now to the 13th eschatological symbol in our series, the third in this particular video, the 200 million man army. Let me read you Revelation 9, verse 14. There's an angel speaking, and we pick up here in verse 14 where the angel is saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet. One angel is talking to another angel, and this is the sixth trumpet judgment. Release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. This is four different angels. Four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. All right, before we talk about the four angels, let's look at this map here of the Euphrates. You'll notice the blue there. The lowermost blue river is the Euphrates River. The Tigris is the uppermost blue river. You'll notice they come down and converge near the Persian Gulf, and then they both run into the Persian Gulf at the bottom right-hand corner of the map. And then at the upper left-hand corner, the Euphrates runs into Syria and then all of a sudden curls north and goes up into southern Turkey. You need to remember the geography of the Euphrates River in order to understand this, because these four angels were bound at the great river Euphrates. Now let's talk about the angels. Somehow they related to the 200 million man army. If you read verse 16, which I'm not going to read, but the two are related somehow. I think that it's easy to say that the angels actually were in charge of the 200 million man army. They were kind of directing the 200 million man army to come down on Israel. But however, the four probably refers to the four corners of the world, because there's going to be destruction all over the land of Israel. Just like we say the four corners of the globe, four corners of the land, that means everywhere. Israel's going to be totally destroyed. Now, look at the map again closely here. You see the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River is north of Israel, and it's also east of Israel. It's north and east of Israel. If you can see Jerusalem, look at the Mediterranean Sea there on the left-hand side of the map, the blue, and you'll see Jerusalem about 3/4 of the way down from the top. On the left is Jerusalem. So the Euphrates River is north and east of Jerusalem. All right. let's move the map here and look at this, the word Euphrates, and see what the four angels have to do with the river Euphrates. Now, as I pointed out on that map, the Euphrates passes over Israel to the north. So the armies invading Israel had to come from the north. Now, why did they have to come from the north? Well, because south of Israel is desert, east of Israel is desert, and west of Israel is the Mediterranean Sea. Now, if you go back into the Old Testament and in the notes to my PowerPoints, I have many examples of how armies which came to destroy Israel always came from the north. For example, Assyria and Babylon, they came from the north. And that's typically where they came from. But now there's a problem here. If we move from here, Revelation 9:14, the seventh seal, the seventh trumpet, and we go to Revelation 16:12 and look at the seventh bowl, the seventh chalice, we read this in Revelation 16:12. Look down in the middle of my PowerPoint here. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east, not from the north. And that used to always bother me. Well, first of all, remember, I made great effort to show you that map. The Euphrates River was to the north and the east of Israel. So any invading army is going to have to cross the Euphrates, and you can call it the north or you can call it the east, either one, because it's the northeast. Either one, it works. Now, historically, when the Jewish war started, the Roman general Cestius Gallus, he sent a large number of troops into Israel. He crossed the Euphrates to do that. Now, why would there be troops on the northeastern side of the Euphrates River? Because that was where the Romans had garrisons to defend the eastern border of the empire. They had to worry about the Armenians to the north and the Parthians to the north of Armenia. They had to worry about the Persians. They had to worry about all these people. They had to defend the Fertile Crescent there, Mesopotamia, and they had garrisons all along the Euphrates River up there. So it was logical that there were troops up there. When they came down to take care of these rebellious Jews, they came from the north and the east. And so we have here in Revelation 16:12 and also in Revelation 9:14 the mention of armies coming over Euphrates. This is referring to Roman armies. But now we got another problem. The army in another verse, which we're going to look at in a minute, is said to be 200 million man strong. The Roman army was not that big. In fact, there's very few armies that big. There's never been an army that big. Now, the futurists always say, well, see this army that's coming from the east, as in Revelation 16:12. It came from the east, and since the Chinese have so many people, they're the only people that could have 200 million people in their army, and so therefore this is a Chinese army that's going to come in the future. This, I will submit to you very humbly, is poppycock. First of all, let's look some more. Before we get to explaining why 200 million does not mean 200 million, let's read verse 15 in Revelation 9. Revelation 9:15, so the four angels, these same four angels who control the troops at the Euphrates River, who had been prepared for the hour, the day, the month, and the year, when God was ready for them, they were released to kill a third of mankind. Now, when you look at that term mankind, that sounds like a worldwide conflagration, a worldwide war, total disaster, nuclear bombs, black helicopters, earthquakes, famines, persecution, the Great Tribulation, and all the Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye stuff. And that word used to throw me when I was examining this. Well, let's look at the word mankind. Sounds like a third of all humanity is about to be destroyed. Now, that's a pretty big massacre for one army to kill a third of all the people on the earth. One army killing a third of all humans on the earth. Do you really believe that? Do you really think that's going to happen? Well, I don't. Well, but I got to deal with this word mankind. Well, it's interesting. The word mankind can very well be translated men. I looked up several translations. The KJV, the traditional King James, has men. In other words, a third of the men that they attack will kill, not of all mankind, but a third of men on the land. And the American Standard Version is a third millennium version, and the Catholic Douay-Rheims version They all translated as men. The New American Standard puts in their margin men. The Greek word is anthropoi. It's interesting. The New American Standard translates that word anthropoi 544 times. 242 times they translate it as man or mans or men's, and 5 times as mankind. And I wonder why that is. Futurist bias of the translators. There are very few preterist translators of the book of Revelation. But the word itself can very easily mean men. In fact, it most probably means men. I looked up in Vines here, looked up anthropos, the Greek word for man. In volume 3 in Vines, page 32, in note 3, I found this buried in a note. Vines says this: it might have been rendered the rest of men. Men. It might have been. It would have made a lot more sense, because I do not believe that one army is going to kill a third of mankind in one big battle. That's, in my humble opinion, preposterous. Now let's look at Revelation 9:16. The number of mounted troops was 200 million. This is the Holman Christian Study Bible. There are other versions that translate the Greek there as 200 million, and that sounds like, oh my gosh, what a huge army. Well, this is a misleading translation. It makes it impossible to refer to Roman armies, because obviously the Roman armies that invaded Israel did not consist of 200 million soldiers. Now, the literal Greek that's translated 200 million is myriad of myriads. Now, I'm going to give you a quote from Robert H. Mounts. He's a very well-known evangelical scholar. He wrote a commentary called the Book of Revelation. On page 201, he says this, quote, attempts to reduce this expression to arithmetic miss the point. A, quote, double myriad of myriads, unquote, is an indefinite number of incalculable immensity. In other words, all John was trying to say is there's one big, huge army coming down on Israel. That's all he was trying to say. He's not trying to say there was literally 200 million. The Greek does not literally say that. Moving on to our next symbol, let's look at the 7 kings. This is in Revelation 17, 9 through 10. This is the 7 heads of the scarlet beast on which the whore of Babylon was seating, just to give us some context here. And John starts explaining the imagery of those 7 heads, which we've already said stand for the 7 hills of Rome. But John's going to add some more symbolism to the 7 heads. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings. So he says there are 2 things. There are 7 mountains and there are 7 kings. We've already seen that the 7 mountains are the 7 hills of Rome. So we're talking about the sea beast has 7 heads, which refers to Rome, but now there's some more symbolism to the 7 mountains. More symbolism to the 7 heads. There are also 7 kings as well as 7 mountains. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain for a little while. Now, let's look at the term 7 here. First of all, we have 7 kings, 7 heads. And I've already said that those 7 heads belong to the sea beast that the whore of Babylon was riding on. We have 7 mountains. I've already said that those stood for the famous 7 hills of Rome. In an earlier video, I couldn't remember the hills, so I looked them up in Wikipedia. The Palatine, the Aventine, the Capitoline, the Quirinal, the Esquiline, the Celian, and the Viminal. Or the Celian, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. And the Viminal Hills. These are the famous 7 hills of Rome. So far the imagery is not difficult. But now, this is what's interesting. Those 7 kings, this is what we're going to focus on here. 5 have already fallen. So let's look at the 5 that have already fallen. Well, let's look at the 7 kings. Who are they? If you'll take the first 7 kings, or the first 7 emperors of the Roman Empire, and if you're going to study ancient history, Roman history, or if you're going to study preterist eschatology, you need to learn these 7. You need to read their biographies. You need to read some Roman history. Number 1, Julius Caesar, you know him. Number 2, Augustus Caesar, Octavian, you know him. 3 is Tiberius, he was the one that was living when Jesus was crucified. 4, Caligula, he was the crazy guy that made his horse a consul. Claudius is the lame guy, Claudius. 6 is Nero, the famous Nero who made Roman candles out of Christians. And you never heard of Galba. He was the first emperor in the famous year of 4 emperors. So let's look at these 7 emperors and see how they fit. All right, first of all, we see that, and we need to remember that John is writing in the mid-60s in the time of Nero, okay? So when he says that 5 have fallen, if you'll see there in the gold and the blue and the underlining there, 5 have fallen. The 5 that have already fallen before Nero, before the time that John was writing, were number 1, Julius Caesar, number 2, Augustus Caesar, number 3, Tiberius, number 4, Caligula, number 5, Claudius. They've fallen. And then John says in verse 10, he says, one king is. That means he's ruling right now as John writes. Well, when is John writing? In the time of Nero. So the one that is Nero. And then it says, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain for a little while. Well, when Nero died, the chaos started, the year of the 4 emperors started, and the first emperor in the year of the 4 emperors was Galba. There's this picture right there on the PowerPoint. Ugly looking dude. He took over. He had not yet come, and he must remain for a little while. He only reigned for 7 months before he got killed. Before he died. 7 months. So John's prophecy fits the 7 kings just perfectly. This is one more evidence that the apocalypse is preterist. Now going on to Revelation 17:11, it says that the beast that was and is not is himself the 8th, yet is of the 7 and goes to destruction. Now this to me was one of the most difficult verses in the book of Revelation. Even after I decided that the preterist scheme is the way you interpret it, I still had trouble with this verse. Well, I'm going to show you that the 8th king is actually not the king. It's the Roman Empire. It's not a king. It's the Roman Empire. The phrasing here makes it sound like he's a king because it says he is of the 7. And when I read that, I said, well, the 7th, how is the 8th king of the 7th? The 8th king, right, you see his picture here is Otho. He came after Galba. He didn't last very long either. How is the 8th king of the 7th? That just made no sense to me. Well, I'm going to read it and try to make some sense of it. All right, the 8th king symbolizes the entire Roman Empire starting with Otho. All the rest of the emperors altogether are rolled up into the 8th, okay? Now, leaving out some words and putting some ellipses in place of it, we can read this verse this way. The beast is the 8th. The beast, leave out that was and is not, put in is and leave out himself and then put in the 8th. The beast is the 8th. Now we've already established that the beast is the Roman Empire, right? So the beast, the Roman Empire, is the 8th. And there you have it. The Roman Empire is the 8th. Well, what about this troublesome phrases of the 7? Of the 7. Well, that just means it's misleading to say that the beast is a emperor, is a king like the first 7 are. It just means that the rest of the Roman emperors have the same beastly nature as the first 7. In other words, this 8th king really represents all of the kings, all of the empires, and he has the same character of the first 7. So the 8th king is really the whole Roman Empire, is really the sea beast. Now, if you'll look back in my PowerPoints here, let me back up one here. Let's look at the logic again. Under 8th, the beast is the 8th. All right, I've already said the beast is the Roman Empire, and the beast is also the 8th king. We've established the beast is the Roman Empire in previous videos and in previous parts of this video. There's no question about that. The beast stands for the Roman Empire. But here the verse says the beast is also the 8th king. Now, two things equal to the same thing are equal to each other. Since the Roman Empire and the 8th king are equal to the beast, the Roman Empire is the beast, the 8th king is the beast, that means the Roman Empire and the 8th king are the same thing. So the Roman Empire is equal to the 8th king. This is comes from geometry or algebra or somewhere, or logic, somewhere back in high school. You know, do you remember that when they said that two things equal to the same thing or equal to each other? Well, this proves it. Mathematically even. The eighth king is not really the king. He's the Roman Empire. Moving along with the 7 kings, chapter 17, verse 11, the beast that was and is not is himself the 8th, and yet is of the seven and goes to destruction. Now remember, the Roman Empire almost disappeared in 68, 69 AD during the year of the four emperors. So that was when the beast is not, when it was disappearing. And yet it had to go to destruction. It came back to life and gradually declined. The decline of the Roman Empire occurred, and the Roman Empire disappeared in the 6th century. Historians date at different times. Some people say at Alaric's time in 511. Some people put it 411, and then 476 when Odoacer took over. Excuse me, let me interrupt myself. I messed those dates up trying to speak from memory. 411 was when Alaric sacked Rome. 476 is when the first barbarian emperor Odoacer took over as emperor. And these are somewhere in that time is the general time when historians date the destruction, the fall of the Roman Empire. All right, the Roman Empire came back from the is-not state when it was almost destroyed in the year of the four emperors, but then it went on to destruction. All right, moving along to our next slide. Our last symbol that we'll take up in this video is Armageddon, the famous Armageddon. Revelation 16, second half of verse 13 to verse 14. Three unclean spirits like frogs are demonic spirits performing signs. Now these three unclean spirits came out of the sea beast, Roman Empire, out of the land beast, the false prophet, apostate Jerusalem, and they came out of the great red dragon, the devil. So you got the devil, the unholy trinity, if you will, the devil, the Roman Empire, and the apostate Jews. So these spirits are demonic spirits performing signs who go abroad to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for battle on the great day of God the Almighty. All right. First of all, that phrase, the day of God. Terms like the day of God typically mean a day of judgment, but not necessarily the last judgment. We hear the day of the Lord, for example. Oh, that's the end of the world. Not necessarily. Could be, but not necessarily. Here's an example in Isaiah 13:6. Isaiah is speaking to the idolatrous Jews of his day, and he says, "Howl ye, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as a destruction from the Almighty." Now, Isaiah is referring to the destruction of Babylon by the Medes. Excuse me, he wasn't speaking to the Jews. He was speaking to the Babylonians. He says, "You're going down. The day of the Lord's coming for you. It's a day of judgment." Now, how about this phrase, to go abroad to the kings of the whole world? That makes this verse sound like a futurist global cataclysm. But now consider Thayer's translation of basileis, which is the accusative form of kings there in this verse. The kings of the whole world. I mentioned this translation earlier. It can mean the leader of the people, the prince, and the commander. So and of course, world, it can be of the Roman Empire. Orchomenos means Roman Empire usually. So we've got these demonic spirits are going out to all the rulers or leaders or commanders of the people of the Roman Empire. Well, that means the demons are getting the armies ready, the armies of God ready, the Roman armies that come in to assemble them for battle on the great day of God when Jerusalem goes down in AD 70. Again, the translation doesn't sound preterist. That's why I'm going over these verses here, because to show you that the translation is critical to understand this. To go abroad to the rulers of the whole world. And remember, the world back then was the Roman Empire. I went over that in the video on the Olivet Discourse. Now, verse 16 of Revelation 16 says, "And they assemble them," referring to the spirits there, "they assemble the rulers, the leaders, at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon." And now, of course, this is the famous Armageddon that has gotten itself into our popular culture, the last battle of the world at the end of the world. I do not believe there will be such a battle, and I'll show why. First of all, let's talk about the literal translation of Armageddon. It's Harmageddon. In Hebrew, Har means mountain, and Mageddon means Megiddo. Megiddo is a city, a village, or a place in Israel. I'm going to show you a map in just a minute. It cannot be interpreted strictly literally because Megiddo is a plain, not a mountain. I'll show you the map in a minute. There was a city called Megiddo, and then the plain of Megiddo was the plain that was around the city. It's also called the Valley of Jezreel. And there's the map. If you will look in the middle on the left-hand corner, the protruding jut there that pokes out into the Mediterranean Sea, that's the present city of Haifa, present-day Haifa. I've been there just recently, as a matter of fact. And right below it is Mount Carmel. On the left, you see the picture of Mount Carmel. Now, if you'll look to the northeast of the mountain range with a shadow there, you'll see a plain, and that plain runs northwest to southeast right through Israel, and it comes down, and it will the land is flat enough to where an army can wind its way through there and come out near Bethshan at the south of the Sea of Galilee, go up on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, go up the upper Jordan Valley there on the flat land there, and then you'll see the blue arrow in the upper right-hand corner of the map. That arrow is pointing to Damascus. So that means, and you'll notice that before an army would get to Mount Carmel, if it was coming up from Egypt, it would come up along the coastal road there by the Mediterranean Sea, and then somewhere it's got to go through that range of mountains. Well, in the shadow of those mountains, on the northeastern side of the mountain, is a little town called Megiddo, and you'll see it there in blue there, Megiddo. If you'll look south and east of Mount Carmel, you'll see Megiddo. Okay, so it's very important to know the geography here. Now, the reference here is probably a reference to both Mount Carmel and the Valley of Megiddo. The mountain of Megiddo. The reason it refers to Mount Carmel, because Mount Carmel is the mountain of Megiddo. It's a mountain that is near the city of Megiddo, the mountain of Megiddo. Okay. Now, why would that be of any interest to John in using that word for symbolism? Well, because at Carmel, the false prophets of Jezebel were defeated there by Elijah in that very famous story. You remember when they laid the wood out and Elijah called down fire from heaven. Likewise, Israel's false prophets will be defeated in AD 70, just like the false prophets of Jezebel were defeated at Carmel. So there's a reference to Carmel, defeat of the bad guys. So that's the first reference, the mountain of Megiddo, Carmel. The second reference is the Valley of Megiddo. Now, the Valley of Megiddo has been associated with mourning all the way back to the time of Ezra. Why? Because if you recall, in 609 BC, Pharaoh Necho II came up from Egypt, and he was going to go through Israel. He wasn't going to bother Israel. He was just passing through on the way to help his allies, the fading, dying Neo-Assyrian Empire, in order to stop the rising Neo-Babylonian Empire, which was very soon to be taken over by Nebuchadnezzar. And this actually happened. The Assyrians were finally totally destroyed in 605 BC, about 4 years later, at the Battle of Carchemish, which is there on the upper Euphrates River in that same area that Necho needed to go through. He needed to follow that blue arrow in the map that I showed you to get up there. Well, as he went up there, Josiah, in what is called the Battle of Megiddo, tried to intercept Necho, which was stupid, and he got himself killed. So this is recorded in the 2 Chronicles 35:25. The scripture says this, it's not recorded there. It's recorded in 2 Chronicles. But the lamentation for the Josiah who was killed there is recorded in 2 Chronicles 35:25. Then Jeremiah chanted a lament for Josiah, and all the male and female singers speak about Josiah and their lamentations to this day. And they made them an ordinance in Israel. Behold, they are also written in the Lamentations. So this was a place of great mourning. Now let's look at another scripture. This is in Zechariah 12, verses 10 through 11. This again talks about the mourning that happened at Megiddo. They shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourns for his only son. This, of course, is quoted in John, also referring to Jesus' crucifixion. Here it's talking about Well, I believe that's what Zechariah was predicting. He was prophesying about the mourning for Jesus, but he's going to compare that mourning to the mourning that was done for Josiah in the valley of Megiddo. So going on with Zechariah verse 12, it says this, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. Verse 11, in that day shall there be a great mourning in Jerusalem, in the day that Jesus is killed. In that day there shall be a great mourning in Jerusalem, as the mourning of Hadadrimmon in the valley of Megiddo. So the mourning for Jesus is compared to the great mourning for Josiah. Hadadrimmon is the place where Josiah was mourned, incidentally. So the idea here that John is trying to make by mentioning Armageddon, the mountain of Megiddo, he's trying to refer to the mourning that went on in Megiddo, and he's saying that the apostate Jews will mourn when they see that Jesus had come and destroyed them and wiped out their city in AD 70. There's not going to be a final battle of Armageddon that ends the world, so I think we need to quit worrying about that. All right, that ends the exposition of the 5 eschatological symbols I wanted to cover in this video. If you enjoyed the video, please click the plus button below and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time.